Hello, everybody. Welcome back to RevDive. We're going to kick things off a little bit differently today. Usually we start you right off with whoever our guest is, but I can't skip over the fact that we are only 100 days away from these gigantic Medicare cuts. And I know there's other stuff coming next year, but I just
gosh.
cannot move past that.
Taya.
Kim, how are you feeling right now about the upcoming
You
year?
know what, Taya? There is a lot to unpack for 2023. And I know every single year we have, anxiety about what's going to happen the upcoming year. But gosh, obviously you heard President Biden announce that we're at the end of a public health emergency. And that announcement alone had ripple effects
Uh,
throughout the industry. So there's
yeah.
a lot to look out for in 2023. My goodness, our hands are going to be
I
full.
think that everybody was either like panicking or enraged when they heard that. And the first thing that I thought about when I heard it, and that combined with the cuts that are coming, and I'm starting to get SGR PTSD, I was like, we need our Spill from the Hill correspondent. So today
Yes.
we're going to welcome back Claire Ernst, Director of Government Affairs at MGMA. And please keep in mind, all of her opinions are her own, but they are all awesome. Welcome back, Claire.
Hi, Claire.
Well, I appreciate that, Taya. Thank you. Thanks. It's good. It's good to be back. And I love that when you're listening to President Biden, the first thing you think of when he says something wonky is that you need to have your podcast.
I need to talk to Claire about this. It was the
Oh
first
my
thing
gosh, yes,
that
yes.
came to
Well,
mind.
yeah. So I'll just reiterate what Taya said. Although I work for MGMA and lots of my opinions are pretty in line with, I am biased towards physician practices. These are my own opinions for purposes of this podcast. So with that being said, so my immediate thoughts, yes, we have 100 days. About 100 days until these Medicare cuts take place. And I too am having SGR PTSD. We have seemingly recreated a very similar
Yes.
situation where we have this cliff at the end of the year where we're scrambling. And so maybe it would be helpful just to do a really quick, I guess, sort of overview of how this has come to be and why we're dealing with this and why we're having like SGR deja vu.
Yeah.
Would
Yes,
that be helpful?
please. If you could explain to the group, because I know that some of our listeners probably weren't around for SGR and they probably don't know what we're talking about. And then the others who were around, like us, like Kim and I, are like, how did we get back into this position?
Exactly.
What is going on?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it's one of the bizarre things that keep me up at night. But the other thing that keeps me up at night is my 4-month-old. So it's good that I don't sleep anyways, because I can just think about this stuff all the time. So back in 2015, Congress passed Macra, which essentially reinvented the wheel, replaced SGR with a new payment system that emphasized value over quantity. And so there was two tracks. There was MIPS, which everyone should be very well acquainted with, and then there were APMs. And the goal was to have people participate in MIPS and then transition them into APMs eventually. The problem was that, in doing so, the positive adjustment for payments froze at a certain point around, I think it's 2021. And so that meant that, like, at that point, we were hoping to have enough practices in APMs, and there was a 5% lump sum bonus. So that was the incentive. Unfortunately, there were not enough APMs created in order to fulfill that. Instead, everyone just ended up staying in MIPS. And so now, you have people remaining in the MIPS pool, but there's no positive adjustment for that. The funny thing is PTAC, which was the group that was commissioned with coming up with these alternate payment models, in which they did approve several. They also never were able to get any of these payment models off the ground, to a point where back in 2019, I think some of the commissioners on PTAC actually quit, and it was like sort of dramatic in a
Wow.
DC wonky, as dramatic as you can get for like, PTAC. Um, anyways, fast forwarding to this. So the fee schedule, is still in place. The conversion factor, which is the multiplier by which all Medicare payment is calculated, that amount, the adjustment was in a freeze. And then in 2021, well, earlier to 2021, effective in 2021, there were changes to the office visits. So the E&M visits were revalued, they were increased, they had historically been undervalued. And so CMS increased them. What I don't think a lot of people realized at the time was they increased them in Medicare, it's a zero net sum game. And so when you make any sort of increases, there have to be decreases in other places. And so when they increase these office visits, they had to decrease the conversion factor, which, in a sense, decreased payment across the board anyway. So even though you had bumps for office visits, they were actually less than what you would have had because of the decrease of the conversion factor. So this is called budget neutrality requirements. And so the fact that this took place in 2021, that's when it was effective. That's why at the end of 2020, we had to deal with these cuts, 'cause everyone was like, oh, wait a second, like, this is really bad. This is like double digit cuts. Like, this kind of, in a way, negates some of the progress we made on the office visit increases. And then, CMS, who's in charge of coming up with the fee schedule every year, they said, oh, like, we can't do anything about this. This is like a Congress thing. And so we were able to rally some of the doctors in Congress and get this one-time fix. I say one time because it was for the next year, but then at the end of last year, it was the same thing. We were like, oh, we have to do this again. And then now we're in September, October of 2022. And we're like, we have to do this again. And it's actually even worse because at the end of 2023 going into 2024, the G code, which was for the add-on complexity code that was finalized and supposed to take effect in 2021, CMS predicted that it would be used almost like 100% of times with office visits. Congress actually delayed that for 3 years because that was that made up for about 3.25% of the cut to the conversion factor. And so we're looking at a very similar conversion factor cut going into 2023 and then 2024, if there isn't like a larger reform, plus then 3% and some change for the G code. And then we have the pay-go sequester, which is what amounts to, that's why we at MGMA, we keep saying there's an 8.5% cut. It's because it's 4%, 4.42% for the conversion factor, which also, had dealt with some other changes within the fee schedule that are proposed. And then the 4% from pay-go, which is basically, whenever too much money is spent on any legislation, money has to be, cut in other places. And Medicare is one of those programs. And so they can cut up to 4%. And the American Rescue Plan that was passed last year was so expensive that it triggered it. And reconciliation, like, this isn't the first time that Congress has passed really expensive legislation, but Congress will usually waive or like wipe the scorecard clean. They can't do that procedurally with reconciliation. And so it had to be waived outside of that legislation. And because the American Rescue Plan was so controversial and so political, no one was really like quick to do this. And so they ended up delaying it for 2022, but it was only delayed for a year. So that's what we're dealing with at the end of this year.
I have to tell you, the more I dig into this stuff, the more the pay-go sequester and budget neutrality terms, I start to feel like it's Harry Potter. When people say those terms, it's like Voldemort. I'm like, shh, those are the words we don't say out loud. Because they cause so much frustration and strife, right? Yeah. You start to, as soon as one of those comes up in an email or podcast or something, like, I cringe. I'm like, again, no, not again.
Yeah, definitely. And and I think for those who, something that I like explain to staffers or people who aren't as well versed with how healthcare and reimbursement work, which you guys are and your listeners largely, I'm sure, are. But, healthcare is one of those areas where if costs get more expensive, you can't inflate the cost of your services. Like you have these contracted rates with Medicare, you have these, and those are rates that, commercial plans base their rates off of. And so the only way to, sort of outrun cuts to revenue would be to, one way would be to grow, which is incredibly difficult because of the workforce shortage issues. So like you can't really outgrow and see more patients.
Yeah.
And then, like at the same time, we have this like pretty unprecedented, or at least not in the last 4 decades, inflation going on right now. And then so the cost of everything is going up too. So it's really hard to cut costs on either side. So I think, policymakers it's important that they understand that it's you can't just raise prices like you would anywhere else, like at a grocery store, at anything. I mean, it's like these are the rates. Yeah. So those almost 10% cuts are a problem.
And I think, what medical practices can do is really look at ways that they can improve efficiencies within their organizations. Because you're absolutely right. Like the rates are the rates. The allowable charges the allowables are the allowables. So trying to find ways to improve efficiencies, doing, more with more. So, really leveraging technology in organizations, making sure that we're capturing, all services and making sure that we're doing reconciliations, payment posting, making sure that we're really tight on our revenue cycle models. So, although we can't really change the cuts that are coming, I think there's a lot that we can do internally to improve some organizational structures. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is some hope, at least for 2023. It looks like we're going to be able to, I feel pretty good about delaying this for another year and then having to deal with it again. But, I think right now the priority is a two-prong approach with MGMA, AMA, a lot of the specialties where we're just trying to prevent these cuts from taking place in the next year. So it buys us enough time to tackle this in a more comprehensive reform. That's something that we're looking at. It's, Congress is also looking at it. They put out these RFIs, requests for information. Doctors Bear and Bouchon in the House just did one a few weeks ago. And they're basically like, this is an RFI and Macra. Like, what should we do? And we're like, question. So, I think that the wheels are turning. But I last week, the House introduced a bill that would at least partly address the cuts to the conversion factor. And so I think we feel pretty confident that we'll be able to push that through by the end of the year. And then Congress has never, I'm pretty sure, not waived PAYGO and like let it go into effect for Medicare. And so if they did, that would be kind of unprecedented. So I'm thinking that, we'll be able to deal with that for next year, but that doesn't negate the fact that, this is going to be an even bigger problem going into 2024.
So for our listeners and our RevDivers, whenever Kim and I are talking, we're speaking, we're always pitching advocacy. Kim and I have always been very heavily involved in advocacy, but for those that we have that are listening in, I think so many people are kind of scared of getting involved because they don't know what to do, and they have all these opinions, they feel these frustrations, but they don't know what they can do to help affect change. So kind of for our general listener base, what would you recommend?
Yeah, so I think that for your general, I think that, I can see how it could be scary to get involved. It's like, where do you start? It's, Congress, DC, MGMA. We try to make it easy for members. We try to make it easy for anybody. I mean, for instance, we have this letter that I sent out to everyone I could think of yesterday. It's just like a template letter that you can use like our software just to send it in. And it's about, these cuts specifically, like asking Congress to avert them before the end of the year. And so I am happy to give out that link. I'm like, send it to your relatives, send it to your friends. Like, I don't care if they like health, if they're like interested or work in healthcare, because it does affect everybody. So I think that's a really good, starting point, and it takes 5 seconds, but, talking to your legislators is also like important, and it doesn't seem like it's a big deal or, it matters, but it does. You can always pick up the phone and call them and complain, complain to them. That's like what they're there for, is to hear you. So, don't forget about that, but, also just reading as much as you can, like trying to see, like for me, a lot of my job is trying to see where things are going and seeing where, like, okay, this is the problem now, but like, where are we going? Like, what are we going to have to deal with in 2024? Like, we already know. And so just kind of educating yourself on that is really important to, help your practice or whoever you're advising to just try to stay one step ahead of it.
Yeah. And, Claire, it seems like just from the experiences that Taya and I have had with the legislature federally and on the state level, they want to hear those stories that, that are happening in medical practices that are impacting their patients, the constituents of these legislators. So it's also good for us to share what's happening. We're boots on the ground for the most part. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to that end, we did a questionnaire survey over the summer where we ended up getting 500 plus medical groups that responded, and we were asking, okay, like, what are these cuts going to do to your practice? Like, operationally, like, we know we don't want them, but like, what decisions are you going to have to be like forced to make, like closing like locations, like limiting hours, not accepting new Medicare patients? And we got great results. I mean, they were like pretty upsetting, but they were great for my purpose. And then I spent all of Wednesday emailing Senate staff, like copying and pasting from each state. Like, these are the cuts, but this is like what your constituents are saying specifically about like what these cuts will do to practices in your district and in your state.
Yeah.
And so having that is really powerful. So Kim's right, like having those experiences, having those stories are, they're really impactful.
Now, Claire,
the stories are always going to be huge.
Yeah. We're coming up on having to address the elephant in the room, which is what the heck is going on with the public health emergency, formally. Everyone is kind of like...
that's the other Voldemort word, Kim.
I know, right?
That's another word we don't say out loud, I think.
But just thinking about the president's comments, but then also thinking about the state of the nation right now, and where we will be at the end of the year, like looking into your glass ball. What do you think? How should we prepare? I mean, obviously we should be doing our due diligence within our organizations to prepare for the end of the public health emergency. And Taya and I, we talk about that nationally and locally, but, from a regulatory perspective, do you see this ending at the end of the year? Sorry to put you on the spot.
So, no, it's okay. My crystal ball.
I said glass ball.
It's really, with the new mom brain, it's really hazy these days. I will say that The public health emergency is, has to be, in order to stay in effect, it has to be renewed every 90 days. And that HHS said that they would give us a 60-day heads up as a courtesy. I personally think that 60 days might be too short of a period of time. I think of the public health emergency and every waiver that's been included as like a rubber band ball. And like, I just like, it's all like tangled up and it's going to take some time to unwind, so to speak. That being said, HHS never gave us that heads up. And so it makes me think that it's going to be renewed again in mid-October, which puts us through mid-February, which puts us through the elections, puts us through a lot of the winter. I'm not quite sure. And, with vaccine authorizations and everything, now that we have like the pediatric, this is just me like hypothesizing, like one reason that I wasn't convinced they were going to end it when we thought they were earlier this year was we needed some of the pediatric vaccines to get pushed through and they needed emergency authorization. Now that like that largely has been done, I mean, I think like the administration's in a better shape. And I think that, the world and our country is also just like, at a different place than they were 2 years ago. But it's created a situation where, you have to make as a business owner, you have to make business decisions based off of things that are temporary that may or may not be, be permanent. And so I think like my non-legal, advice would be, to prepare for the end of it because it's not going to be forever. That being said, things like telehealth, for instance, that has catapulted telehealth decades forward. I mean, I was working on telehealth way before this, and we couldn't even get like mental health services to be done in the home. And so the fact that, back in 2016, like 0.25% of Medicare beneficiaries use telehealth, and now we have the number that we have now is really telling. So I do think that some of these things that were, temporary flexibilities during the pandemic will be made permanent to some extent. And so you don't have to plan for necessarily like no more telehealth, but, I think you do need to make these business decisions based off of what's going on too in your state, because, things like telehealth, there's federal rules, but there's also state licensure rules. And so just making sure that you're following and you're acquainted with all the state rules as well is important.
Yeah, we totally agree. I mean, this is the telehealth waivers are going to really impact medical practices when they end, especially the originating site requirements. That's going to be a huge component. Luckily, we've had the announcement and publication that mental health services are going to get that that extension, that expansion permanently. But we haven't gotten that for the evaluation and management services yet, which is like, a lot of us have our fingers crossed and really hope that is going to, push through. But yeah, I think we just need to prepare.
I think it's been very frustrating also for people who aren't used to coming in to see their doctors, especially like think rural docs, right? Some of their patients are 4 hours from there. So if they get hurt, let's say they're out working on the farm or they're not feeling well, whatever, if they can telehealth into their primary care doc and identify, do I need to come in or is this something I can treat at home?
Right.
There's that opportunity to prevent an exacerbation.
Yeah.
And now they've had 2 years of getting used to, I can call my doctor from my phone and connect with them and stay engaged with them. When that goes away, I don't think you're going to see them, I don't think we're going to see patients going, okay, I'll just drive the 4 hours then. I think we're just going to see that fall back off. And I think we're going to see those rising costs from exacerbations again.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, Congress keeps asking for more data in terms of like cost and quality outcomes. But the problem with collecting this data before making anything permanent is that the data is largely skewed towards the pandemic. And so if you're looking at data from before the pandemic, there's really not any data. If you're looking for data that we've been able to like really comb through thus far, it's been largely, substantive care as opposed to maybe additive care, which might be more like what Taya you're talking about, like triaging a situation, trying to figure out whether or not it necessitates coming in. I think the payment piece is something because I don't see CMS like reimbursing at the non-facility rate forever. I see them reverting back to the facility rate, and that really hasn't. That's like in some services that's like a 60% difference in payment, and so it really makes a difference for your business model whether that's sustainable or not. But I do agree that it's very convenient and it's appropriate. It's not always appropriate. That's why not everything is on not everything's on the telehealth list. I think it makes sense to have practitioners decide what is appropriate, but it has like ramifications for the whole family too. Like when you think about older adults who have Medicare and they need to go to the doctor. They're not always mobile. They're not always cognizant enough to be able to actually get to the doctor. So you have adult children taking off like an entire day of work to take them to the doctor when, like they could just call in and figure out like if it's actually necessary to do. So there's so many different, benefits to it. I think that there need to be appropriate guardrails for sure. But, I think this is just going to be a longer project. We have 5 months from the end of the pandemic that Congress has allowed for these flexibilities to remain intact. So we'll see what happens after. But I don't think it's a knock against Congress to say that Congress rarely acts until they kind of like the 11th hour until they need to. And so I don't foresee them making anything permanent really before that point.
Yeah. And just kind of looking to the future, there's a lot that we all need to stay on top of. And you made a really good suggestion that we just need to stay in touch with, credible sources like MGMA and others who are putting out, good content, new information. Claire, we really hope to have you back soon. We are coming up to, October 1st, where we're going to have our ICD-10 changes. And then January 1st, we're going to have our CPT and HCPCS updates. So gosh, lots more to get prepared for. But Claire, thanks so much for being with us today. This has been amazing.
Thank you for having me.
Always
I love talking with you guys.
Yes, we love getting our spill from the hill. So thanks for that.
Sorry, it's never a good spill. It's always like really disappointing. Maybe one day when you have me on, it'll be like good news, but usually I'm yeah.
Well, this has definitely been helpful for us and for our listeners. So until we meet again, Rev Divers, keep diving into those Rev cycles.